This is Andrew Stotts talking about careers in finance with Angus Mackintosh. Angus, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Right, yes. Hello, listeners and Valuation Masterclass. My name is Angus Mackintosh. I am an investment analyst currently, working with a platform called Smart Pharma. I analyze companies, equity bottom up, mainly equities, from a bottom up perspective. And I also look at macro situations and thematic situations in sectors and markets. So that's where I am currently. But obviously, I've been working in the industry in one way or another, probably now for about 25 years plus. So rather a long time. I was saying to Andrew earlier that actually when I started, I didn't really intend to go into finance at all. In fact, I did a degree in politics and international relations. But I always had a big interest in Asia, and that was driven by some of the coursework I was doing, but also the fact that I love traveling, and I'd spent a lot of time in Asia, in India, in Thailand, and in fact I traveled in Latin America and Africa. So I'd done a lot of roots on the market, and had a lot of interest in the culture and politics and everything else. I sort of fell into the finance thing and stockbroking initially through going to have a chat with a contact that I had in the industry. So I went to have a chat, and he said, "Have you considered working in the City of London?" I said, "No, actually, I hadn't considered that." He said, "Well, I think you should go and talk to my friend in Cazenove in London, which was a stockbroker in London." And I said, "Yeah, I'm very happy to go and have a chat." The initial idea was to go and work with a trading company like Swires or Jardine Matheson, and go and sort of do that kind of thing. It was very varied and focus on all sorts of different sectors. But I did go and have a chat with so I got a letter back from this chap at Cazenove, which was on the thickest paper you can imagine, with a list of 50 partners in sort of embossed writing. I went, "Oh, this looks a bit serious." So I prepared myself and I learned about Cazenove. So I went and did my preparation ahead of the interview. I learned about Cazenove. I learned about the city. I learned about Big Bang, which was the whole deregulation which happened in London in the late 80s. So I sort of had some understanding. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but I had some understanding of the finance in the city. But and I had studied economics at university, so I had some understanding of economics, but only some. I think we'll get onto that later. So I went for an interview. I ended up having 3 interviews and meeting 4 partners, and then being offered a job. And it was actually my first ever interview. So I've never really, I've been extremely lucky in that respect. But I wouldn't say. I would also say if you don't get it right first time, it will eventually come right if you're really determined. So don't give up after the first hurdle is not got over.
So where did they put you? What did they do with you?
Well, that was the interesting thing, and I think this is also a lesson for anyone going into the industry. And I'm not sure if it happens in the same way now that it did then. But I went into a graduate training program, on which there were only about 12 of us, and had a great bunch of people. So a lot of them I still keep in touch with, would you believe, 25 years later. So I made very good friends, and actually also very good business contacts. So the socialization side of things was very important. And at that time, you were sent to all the different departments. I started off in the library. So all these old ladies, looking over the newspapers. We don't do that anymore. And then you'd have to go through and you'd look at a company name, and then you'd look at a list which had all the partners at the firm who had an interest in that company. And you'd put their initials against the article, and it would go off and you'd copy it. And the copies would have to be sent individually to each partner who had an interest in that particular company. So, I mean, that was kind of how, in a way, antiquated to tracks, and in that position, actually, it kind of stamped the fact that you had to get things right. You can't make mistakes with numbers. So in the contract department, I was actually sort of booking out trades. So you had to be very, very focused on getting the number right. And you don't make mistakes very often. If you make a mistake, you remember it.
Mm.
So I was lucky I didn't make any serious mistakes in the settlement thing, but it sort of taught you had to be very, very focused on that. It also, you got to know all the guys in the back office and the middle office, which meant that if you had a problem with the trade, you could talk to them. And the reason you talk to them is they take you to the pub. When you were sitting in settlements and you'd got to know them and what they did in their normal life and all the rest of it. So there was a social element to it, and the nice thing about Cazenove is you got to know everyone in the whole firm.
Mm.
So the initial period, and during that time, they set you up to start to study for the registered representatives exam, which is a very basic qualification that you need to be able to talk to clients and so on in the city. But that involved quite a lot of study on valuation, basic valuations and so on. It's called the Regi Reps, and the idea was you didn't fail it. So because no one, I was number 12 out of 12 people, and no one else had failed it. So if I'd failed it, I would have felt pretty low. So I managed to pass that, but that was done, during the period of learning about the back office and the rest of it. And then I spent some time in UK research with the head of research, sort of shadowing him, helping out with projects, mainly sort of crunching numbers and helping with weeklies and that kind of thing, just getting to know what the analysts do. And I sat with a few analysts during that time covering UK. And then I spent 3 months in fund management. So I sat with a fund manager and just shadowed them. In fact, that time I spent a lot of time just reading research, it wasn't probably enough proactive stuff during that period. But anyway, I got to know what they did and went sat in on meetings and that kind of thing. And then I was.
By the way, what year was that? And you were still in London at that time, right?
I was still in London at this time, and this was in 1990.
Okay. So then occasionally analysts would come out of Asia or, pop into the.
We'll get on to that. So exactly. Well, no, what happened was that when I originally applied, I went to have a chat with Cazenove. I expressed an interest in working in the Far East, as it was called. That was kind of during my interview process, I'd made that point. They said, well, yes, you go through the graduate training program, we'll see what happens. So anyway, I did a stint with doing a UK PEP, which was a personal equity scheme. It was basically PEPs were tax-free vehicles. You could buy into a company through a tax-free vehicle, put it into your PEP, and if the share price went up, you had £5,000 a year. You wouldn't get any capital gains tax. So I went around to all these shareholders' meetings with a stall with Cazenove selling the cable and wireless PEP to shareholders. So I got to know what happens at AGMs and EGMs and saw all the people coming through and getting the free sandwiches and the free wine. That's what a lot of shareholders went for. So I did that. And then I moved and spent 3 months on the Japanese desk. So we're on to probably a year, just over around a year now. So I spent, and that was very much sort of shadowing the partner, helping to write the weekly, so liaising with analysts in Asia and putting all their stuff together into a weekly format. So it was learning to condense ideas about stocks.
Mm.
And that didn't necessarily, and at that time, you had to look through these big books of valuations, which showed you rights issues and everything else. It was like a Bible, very, very thin paper. I don't know if you remember that, Andrew. It was a Japanese Bible of stocks.
I don't remember that one, but I know I started in WI Carr days in 1994 when I started at WI Carr, and we used to make the books and mail them out, of the dividends.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And at that time,
that was value added.
It was value added. Well, a friend of mine started something called the estimate directory. Now, the estimate directory is what consensus forecasts are now.
Right. TED estimate. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So that was the first time you could get multiple brokers' forecasts in one place, and it was in a printed book, which again had very thin pages. So, and they would go around all the brokers and say, "Will you put your estimates into the estimate directory?" And everyone would go, "Yes." And then each time they published it, then you could see the revisions and everything else. So results came out, and you'd flick to the estimate directory and look for that company and find out whether it was above or below consensus. So, I think times have changed. And remember, at the point that I started, we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have the internet. We had all the orders went out on telexes. and faxes were just sort of coming in. So fax stuff you could do, but everything was photocopied around the desk. You know, and you if you had to write something, you'd give it to a secretary. The secretary would write it on the computer.
Now, I think it's worth highlighting that, you know, in the old days, information was value added. And
yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Nowadays, there's almost no value added in information anymore.
Well, I think that is true to some extent. There's so much information around that, you know, the value added you get from what's on screens is
reducing the information.
But there is value added in meeting companies and talking to management, because that's not insider information.
Yep.
But what it is information coming at you from someone who really believes in it or doesn't, or you know, do you trust them? Do you not? And you know, I've had some very successful clients, for example, First State Investments, used to be Stuart Ivory.
Yep.
First State Investments went from $1 billion to about $50 billion under management in about 10 years, because they had such good performance. And the reason that they had such good performance, and that's through very difficult up and downs of markets and everything else, through volatility, was that their main focus was on the quality of management. And and that's difficult to measure. And obviously on the quality of the company, business, strategy, and everything else. But effectively, the core value was on you know, how good and how trustworthy they thought the management was, you know, and what their track record was like, especially with dealing with minorities. You know, no matter how sexy the business might seem, if suddenly they turn around and leg over minorities in some way, then it all becomes irrelevant, you know, because the share price will probably collapse.
I remember going to meet them many times, and you know, presenting my ideas. I'm curious what your opinion is now. Is that if somebody was to say, I like that style, quality of management, you know, that's the way I want to manage money, and I want to set up a fund and base it upon that, how difficult or easy would it be for them to, number one, differentiate themselves, and number two, to outperform as compared to, you know, in those days?
I think it's still very relevant, to be honest. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, what has happened is that those companies which do have very good governance and high quality management have tended to trade up to very high valuations. So probably when the companies were first bought into by companies like First State and Stuart Investors or Aberdeen, or, you know, there are a number of those sort of companies who take a similar approach, then, you know, they were probably relatively cheap, but they've now soared to really very high valuations. So look at things like, you know, Unilever Indonesia, which trades on, you know, 40 times PE.
Or price to book.
And yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, well, that's completely accurate. It has an ROE, of course, of 197%.
Exactly.
No, and the other ones I would put in the same basket would be things like CP All in Thailand, which runs 7-Eleven stores, you know very well, which tends to trade on you know, quite high multiples. I mean, they have seen a sell-off recently, but that's kind of I think to some extent there might be a bunch of hedge funds going around looking for short ideas in consumer stocks because they're quite highly valued and easy to justify. So these stocks are trading on high valuations for a reason. So, you know, they have high quality management and so on. So you have to pick your time, and you know, and you know, it's not always easy to find, you know, new ideas. You know, they tend to be more few and far between because of the flow of information now. So not to say it doesn't happen.
What if we think about a young person entering into the world of finance, and, you know, they haven't really totally decided where they think they fit, but they're thinking about kind of the skills, you know, from your perspective, what are the skills that are necessary today to build a successful career in finance?
Well, I mean, as I say, I mean, number one is that you have to really want to do it. So you've got to be very interested in it. That might be an interest in might be an interest in the macro side of things. It might be an interest in markets. It might be an interest in valuing companies, and an interest in actually seeing those companies outperform, running a portfolio. I mean, there are lots of different reasons. I mean, I think you've got to have an understanding, a decent grounding in valuation, and understand what it all means. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, so not everyone is suited to being to doing very complicated models and everything else. They might still be suited to writing research, because they're very good at the narrative and explaining in simplistic ways, and ways that are very easy to understand. People don't just get lost. I mean, I quite easily get lost in some analyst reports when you can read the first 4 pages and not really know what the company does.
So how important is that narrative? I mean, that's a great word. The word narrative is, a separate thing. Fine, you've got your numbers and you run through all those, but if you don't get your narrative smooth, nobody's gonna.
I think the narrative and an understanding of what really the company is about, what it's trying to achieve, and how it's going to get there. I mean, in my experience from attending, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of meetings with fund managers as a broker, because we used to accompany the companies we take on roadshows, was that, the best clients were not the ones who are interested in the nitty gritty of the last set of quarterly results. And indeed, that applied to the analysts as well, in my experience. But there were ones who really understood the key levers for the company to succeed or not to succeed would be, and the key risks, and what they were most optimistic about, and right down to I think one fund manager, Angus, quite famous fund manager at First State, used to ask the CEO what his PA holdings were. To get a flavour for the type of investor he was. Sort of slightly off the wall questions, which always bring a smile to the face. So, I mean, the skill sets, also, being able to sort of condense ideas into a short and succinct description, understanding that, rather than being an expert in understanding, each tiny little box on a spreadsheet, which won't actually make a huge difference to your number at the end of the day.
Angus, I have a story that I always tell about one of my analysts when I was head of research, that came to me. He applied for a job. He'd never been an analyst, but there was something about this guy that I could see that he could get the narrative. He could build the relationships with the people in the industry that he was going to cover. And he was passionate about it, but he didn't have the financial skills at all. And I hired him. And I said, don't worry about the financial. I'm going to create the financial models for the companies you're going to cover. And I've got one guy here with me, and he and I are going to support you on that. We'll teach you as you go along. Get out there and get the story. And that analyst ended up becoming a very successful analyst in his career.
Right. Well, I'm not at all surprised at that. And I think that, companies like CLSA, which you know very well, were built by journalists effectively.
Yep.
And it's quite journalistic in the way that it presents ideas, and sometimes maybe a bit sensationalistic, but I think pretty good. And WI Carr was of a similar mold, which I worked there as well. For 2 years.
When were you there?
I worked there the last 2 years of his existence.
Okay.
And it was a great 2 years. I mean, I really enjoyed it. That was a kind of work hard, play hard environment, and clients loved it. We had very good analysts, and there was a great camaraderie amongst everyone who worked there.
Definitely.
I find the same actually was true at Merrill Lynch, which I joined, not the next job, but the one after. A similar kind of camaraderie and atmosphere, which is another thing I would also say is that that culture in which you work within, you're going to work for firms, is very important, because it either keeps you're going to be happy or unhappy in a culture. Where collegiate culture is one that works very well. Sort of egotistical culture is sometimes it just makes people feel uneasy, unhappy, stressed out. I think it's with everyone's working together and helping each other out, and that's the best environment you could ever work within. So a good team works very well.
So I want to wrap this up, and maybe this is a good place to wrap it up by maybe you can give your final comments about two things that you've just talked about that I think are important to highlight. You talked about at the beginning of your career, and I'm sure it's lasted your whole career, the value of relationships. And then the second part is the value of the environment. Maybe you could just, for young people, you could help them understand how important these things are, and, how to go about, making sure that they get the best out of those two things.
Well, I mean, I think to start with, it's very important to be willing to go the extra mile for the people you work with, especially people who have got a lot of experience, so listen to people, learn from their experience, and be happy to put yourself out to do stuff which you might think is quite menial, but
Mm.
and that might be going to get the coffee or whatever, but I think it's doing stuff which can help the more senior people to do their job, get involved, and it gives you opportunities to shine in effect as well if you can sort of help them out with what they're trying to do. So that's I think very important. Just get on with people, and obviously we all work in diverse environments, and that's there's great value in diversity. You can learn a lot from different ways different people work and everything else, and you suddenly find yourself thinking, well, where did I pick? Oh, I picked that up from X, Y, or Z, and it's stuck with me for this long, so. And that would be as sort of mindful as I still remember the guy who told me to look something up on Google, and I'd never heard of it.
I can remember that guy too. That same one guy was just told me Google, and I was like, "What do you mean?
What's Google?" Anyway, so it goes to that point. And so your second question.
So the other one is the environment. One is kind of the relationships, and what you've said now is help people out and help them do their job when you're young. The other one is the value of the environment within the company.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is important, because when you go through an interview process, you will undoubtedly meet with a number of different people, and I mean, you get a feel for the types of characters that work within a firm, and whether you're going to work within it. And your view on these things will change over time. I mean, I initially sort of set out, I don't want to go work for an American firm because they're hire and fire, and this is a long time ago. But actually, thinking back on it, probably maybe I should have taken that opportunity to go work at Goldman Sachs and actually when I went to Merrill Lynch, I went, well, this is not at all what I thought it would be like. And I think these things change, and the cultures change, and all firms are very diverse nowadays. So I mean, I think you just want to go with someone who you think is going to have commitment to markets, and commitment to what you're doing. And there are certain firms that do, and there are certain firms that don't. And the ones that don't, quite often people will go and work for them for short periods of time for a high short-term reward. But after 2 years, they're having to look for another job, and that's not necessarily the best way forward.
Yep.
So try and sort of take a slightly longer-term view.
That's great. I want to close out with a little. Normally, I close out with your story, but I'm going to close out with a little story from me, because you said something how you can still remember that person, for instance, that said, and told you to Google something. I just would remember a time when I was a young guy at WI Carr. It was 1995. I was, started in the industry in 1993. And, I was moving up fast. And there was a strategist that worked at WI Carr. And he had moved, David Scott, who moved from being head of research to being a strategist in Hong Kong. So I went to Hong Kong as a young analyst, and I was presenting after him. And it was amazing. Like, the guy had, first of all, just about to go out on the stage, and he had a table that he was sitting at. And first thing is that he had this, he had his collar up like this. I was like, David, do you see that? And it was just kind of funny how he was kind of like in another world. And then when he sat down, it was all this messy paper, and his message was just a mess. And it's like, and then I watched him slowly pull that mess together, and then build it into a story, build it into an argument, build it into a crescendo, and then have the whole audience, in his hands by the end of this thing. And I realized that half of this, he was, constructing, a whole presentation method that he had. And that's when I really started off with the idea of, how to give a great presentation. And David is one that I just remember so well.
I completely agree with you, and I've seen that happen live myself, taking him up to Scotland. And of course, he started off talking about the second bottle of wine he'd had the night before. And then he opened his briefcase and pulled out this scruffy bit of paper and says, "Look at this, US truck sales."
Exactly.
And the 30 fund managers were all enraptured immediately.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I appreciate you taking the time to explain, your perception of the industry and how it can help young people who are getting started. And from my perspective, it's been a great industry, and I still think, there's so much opportunity in it. And so I think you've been able to help young people to think about how they can position themselves. So for that, I want to thank you.
That's my pleasure. And, if you did want any follow-up calls, or if anyone ever wanted to message me, feel free. I'm always happy to help.
That's great. I will definitely do that. All right. I'm going to sign off now.